If a town wants you dead before sundown, it usually means you know something the town can't afford to hear. By the time the church bell rang its last lazy note across Dry Creek, every porch was crowded, every window was cracked open, and every pair of eyes in town was fixed on the wooden platform in the middle of the square. Rose Redbird stood there alone, the desert wind tugging at the loose strands of her black hair, the hem of her faded dress brushing against sun-bleached boards that had carried speeches, auctions, and harvest prayers, but never anything as ugly as this. No one called it ugly, of course. Men in dusty hats called it justice. Women with folded hands called it necessary. Boys too young to understand repeated whatever they heard their fathers say. And Sheriff Elias Voss, standing straight beside the platform with his badge catching the light, called it order. Rose said nothing. That was the part that unsettled them most. She did not beg. She did not cry. She did not curse the town or plead for mercy from people who had already traded truth for comfort. She only looked out over the crowd as if memorizing every face, every false look of certainty, every mouth that had decided her story without ever asking for her words. The air smelled like hot timber, horse sweat, and dust, the kind of late-day heat that sticks to your skin and makes tempers feel 1 inch shorter than they were at sunrise. Somewhere off to the side, a mule stamped against the hitch rail. A screen door slapped shut. A baby began fussing in the arms of a woman near the general store, then went quiet again as if even the child could feel the town holding its breath. They said Rose Redbird killed Frank Delaney by the creek road. They said she had reason, that widowhood had made her bitter, that Apache blood ran hot when crossed, that a woman living alone beyond the Cartonwoods was bound to bring trouble sooner or later. The story had grown fast, the way bad stories do in places where people fear what they do not understand and trust the loudest voice in the room more than the truest one. By noon, rumor had become certainty. By 3 o'clock, certainty had become punishment. And now, with the sun lowering behind the ridge and painting the whole town in copper light, Dry Creek had come together to watch itself feel righteous. Sheriff Voss lifted a hand for silence, though the square was quiet already. Rose turned her face slightly toward the west, toward the open road disappearing into a shimmer of heat, and for one brief second a strange expression crossed her features, not hope exactly, and not fear either, but the look of someone listening for something far away that only she believed might come. Most people never noticed it. They were too busy waiting for the sheriff to speak, too busy enjoying the safety of being part of a crowd. But before he could open his mouth, before the town could finish what it had started, a sharp sound rolled in from beyond the last line of buildings, the hard, fast rhythm of hoofbeats cutting through the silence like a challenge, and every head in Dry Creek turned toward the road at once. The horse came in fast enough to scatter dust across the first row of boots, and the rider did not slow until he reached the edge of the square. The animal stopped hard, sides heaving, while the man in the saddle took in the whole scene with one long, unreadable look. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and sun-browned, with a dark hat pulled low and a trail coat faded by miles of weather. Nothing about him looked polished, and nothing about him looked accidental either. This was not a drifter wandering into trouble. This was a man who had ridden straight at it. Sheriff Elias Voss stepped forward first, his hand resting near his belt more from habit than nerve. The town was watching him now, and men like Voss cared as much about appearances as they did about law. "You are late if you came for the hanging," he said, his voice carrying clear across the square. A few people laughed, eager and thin. The rider swung down from the saddle without hurrying. His boots hit the dirt with the kind of confidence that made men on porches sit a little straighter. "Then I am right on time," he said. The laughter died all at once. Rose Redbird had not moved since the hoofbeats began, but now her eyes fixed on the stranger with a sharpness that did not match the dull surrender the town had expected to see in her. She knew him. Or if she did not know him, she knew what his arrival meant. That alone was enough to stir a fresh wave of whispering through the crowd. The stranger took off his gloves one finger at a time, then looked up at the platform, not at the sheriff, not at the men in front, but at Rose herself. "You cannot do this today," he said. It was not a plea. It was not even an argument. It landed like a fact, and facts had become rare in Dry Creek. Sheriff Voss squared his shoulders. This is town business. No, the rider said, still looking at Rose. This is a town mistake. The word slipped through the square like cold water. Some people frowned. Others glanced at each other as if waiting to see who would speak first. Near the general store, old men who had been nodding along with the sheriff all afternoon suddenly looked less certain. The stranger finally turned and faced the crowd. "My name is Cole Mercer," he said, and the name meant nothing to most of them until he added, "I knew Thomas Redbird." At that, Rose lowered her eyes for the first time, and for one fleeting second something softened in her face, something too quick for the town to understand. Thomas Redbird had been dead nearly a year, but his name still lived in corners of memory where pride and debt were kept. A few men remembered him as quiet. A few remembered him as stubborn. One or two remembered owing him more than they ever repaid. Cole Mercer let that silence breathe before he went on. If his widow hangs before sunset, then a lie becomes law in this town. The sheriff stepped up onto the first board of the platform, as if height alone might give his voice more weight. "You ride in here from nowhere and expect us to stop because you knew her husband. I expect you to stop because the dead man had enemies," Cole said. "More than one. And because the person in the biggest hurry to blame this woman has more to lose than she does." That struck the crowd harder than any shouted accusation. Heads turned. Not all at once, not openly, but enough. People began looking sideways instead of forward. Looking for a flinch. Looking for a face that knew too much. Rose stood in the center of it all, the wind pressing her dress against her legs, her chin lifting by the slightest measure as if the weight in the square had shifted a single inch. Sheriff Voss noticed it too, and he did not like it. "You have got 1 minute," he said. "Say what you came to say." Cole Mercer glanced over the crowd, slow and careful, as though he had been searching for one man since the moment he crossed into Dry Creek. Then his gaze stopped near the front, and the change in his expression was so small most people would have missed it. Most people, but not Rose. Because in that instant, she knew this was never only about saving her. It was about someone standing in that square, someone who had expected the whole thing to be over before the dust on Cole Mercer's coat ever reached town. Jed Mercer stepped forward through the front edge of the crowd as if the square belonged to him, as if all this heat and dust and staring silence had been waiting for his voice to give it shape. He was a broad man with a clean vest, polished boots, and the kind of face people trusted too quickly because it looked settled, respectable, and certain. Dry Creek had men like that in every important corner, men who never seemed in a hurry until truth began catching up to them. Delaney was pressing her over that land because the line was never clear, Jed said, loud enough for the porches and windows to hear. Everybody knows there had been trouble out there for months. A few heads nodded at once, relieved to hear something familiar, something easy. Easy stories were the backbone of towns like this. They kept decent people from asking indecent questions. Cole Mercer did not answer right away. He watched Jed the same way a man studies a card player who has shown his hand too soon. Then he took one step closer, boots grinding softly in the dust. "You seem mighty eager to explain Frank Delaney's business," he said. Jed's jaw tightened, but only for a breath. A man does not need to be eager to know what everybody already knew. No, Cole said, but he might be eager to keep folks from asking what they did not. The square grew still again. Even the horse at the rail had gone quiet. Sheriff Voss looked from one brother to the other, and if the resemblance had not been clear before, it was now. Same sharp cheekbones. Same steady eyes. Same way of standing when challenged. But where Cole carried the look of a man weathered by hard miles, Jed wore it like a claim to authority, something he believed the town owed him. Rose saw it all from the platform and felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the wind. She had wondered the moment Jed spoke why the name struck so hard in her chest. Now she knew. Mercer. Cole Mercer. Jed Mercer. The truth sat between them like a loaded secret, plain as daylight if anyone cared to see it. The crowd began to sense it too, though not yet the shape of it. People shifted. Faces turned from the platform to the brothers and back again. This had stopped being a simple punishment, and nothing unsettled a crowd faster than the feeling that it had arrived early for the wrong ending. Cole spoke again, slower this time, as if giving Dry Creek one last chance to hear itself think. "Let us talk about the land, then." Thomas Redbird kept papers. He kept them in order because he knew men around here respected ink more than memory, and fences more than fairness. Frank Delaney had been trying to get his hands on those papers for months. At that, Rose lifted her eyes. She had not heard anyone say Thomas's name with that kind of certainty since the day they laid him to rest beneath the Cartonwoods. For a moment the square fell away, and she saw her husband at the rough pine table in their cabin, smoothing creased documents with both hands, reading each line twice by lamplight because he trusted paper only after he had tested it against truth. He had told her more than once that some men smiled when they wanted your land and frowned only after they lost the chance to take it. Delaney had smiled often. Jed seized on the pause before anyone else could. "That proves nothing," he snapped. Delaney had dealings with half the county. "Dealings, yes," Cole said. But not all of them ended with him needing a widow blamed before sundown. The last. Words drifted across the square and seemed to settle on every shoulder at once. A woman near the bakery pressed a hand to her throat. Old Mr. Hanley on the barber shop porch pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. Dry Creek was beginning to hear the ugliest part of itself, not in what it had done, but in how quickly it had been willing to do it. Sheriff Voss stepped forward at last, his voice clipped and strained. "Enough. You have made your point. The town heard you." "No," Cole said, looking straight at him, "they heard the beginning." Then he turned back to Jed, and this time there was no mistaking the steel in his face. "Tell them where you were the night Delaney went to the Creek Road, Jed. Tell them why you knew about Rose's land before the sheriff ever said a word. Or shall I tell them what our father used to say about men who rush to bury a story before anyone has read it?" Rose felt the whole town lean toward the answer, and for the first time since they dragged her into the square, she saw something she had not expected to see on Jed Mercer's face. Not anger. Not pride. Fear. Jed Mercer did not answer right away, and in Dry Creek that silence said more than any clean excuse could have. The town had always known him as a man with a ready word, a steady smile, and a way of stepping into a room like he belonged at the center of it. Men trusted that sort of confidence because it made their own doubts feel smaller. But now, with Cole Mercer standing in the square and Sheriff Voss losing his grip on the crowd one heartbeat at a time, Jed's confidence seemed to pull in on itself. He glanced first at the sheriff, then at the faces around him, measuring how much of the town was still his and how much had already started slipping away. "You come riding in after months on the trail," Jed said at last, his voice controlled but thinner than before, "and you expect people here to take your word over the word of a sheriff, over the eyes of men who found Delaney, over common sense." Cole did not blink. Common sense is what people call it when they do. Not want to admit they skipped the hard part. That line moved through the square like a shift in weather. People who had come ready to witness certainty now found themselves standing inside a question, and questions made decent folks uneasy. Rose Redbird felt it in the quiet around her, in the way the front row no longer held itself with the same righteous stiffness, in the way even those who still wanted her condemned seemed less willing to be first to say so. She stood as still as she had before, but inside her chest something had changed. It was not hope yet. Hope was dangerous, especially for a woman who had spent the day watching neighbors decide that her life could be measured by rumor. But it was something close to balance returning after hours of standing on the edge of a fall. Cole turned slightly, enough for his voice to carry to every porch and window. "Let me tell you what happened after Thomas Redbird died," he said. "Because that is where this began, whether you know it or not." Sheriff Voss started to protest, but the protest came too late. The town wanted to hear it now. They had been handed a crack in the story, and once people saw daylight through a lie, they could not stop themselves from looking. "Thomas kept his place in better order than most men in this county," Cole said. "Fence lines marked. Water rights noted. Receipts folded and stacked. Land papers wrapped in oilcloth and kept dry no matter the season. He knew exactly what belonged to him and what did not. Rose closed her eyes for half a second at the sound of that truth spoken aloud. Thomas had been that kind of man. Quiet, careful, patient with work and impatient with fools. He had believed that if a person lived honestly enough, the world would eventually answer with fairness. Rose had loved him for that, even when she knew the world better than he did. After he passed, Cole went on, Frank Delaney started visiting that property more often. First with polite questions. Then with offers. Then with pressure. A murmur spread at once because that part rang true to more than one person in town. Delaney had a reputation for making friendly business feel like a favor right up until the moment a man realized he was being cornered. Cole let the sound die down before continuing. Rose did not sell. She did not leave. She did not bend. And that made her a problem for any man who thought a woman alone would be easier to move than a fence post. Jed laughed then, but there was no warmth in it. And now you are an expert on what happened at her cabin too. No, Cole said, just on what kind of men circle a widow when they think no one will stand beside her. The sheriff's jaw hardened. He could feel the mood slipping, and men like Voss feared disorder most when it came dressed as truth. Enough of this, he said sharply. You got no witness, no court paper, no authority to hold this square. Maybe not, Cole said, but somebody here has a witness. That changed everything. The crowd seemed to lean as one toward the words. A witness meant this was no longer one man's challenge against a sheriff's judgment. It meant there was another set of eyes in Dry Creek, another voice that had stayed quiet while the town rushed toward shame. Rose felt her pulse quicken. She knew there were people who had seen more than they admitted. Towns always had them. People who watched through curtains. People who heard footsteps after midnight. People who kept truth hidden because silence felt safer than honesty. Cole swept his gaze toward the row of storefronts, toward the boarding house porch, the stable lane, the narrow spaces between buildings where secrets tended to live longer than they should. Someone saw Delaney meet a man that night, he said. Not Rose. A man. Someone saw enough to know this town nearly punished the wrong soul for the convenience of a lie. The square went so quiet that the wind itself seemed to pause. Then Rose noticed it, small as a twitch, easy for anyone else to miss. Across the way, near the boarding house steps, Abigail Frost had gone pale. Abigail Frost had been standing on the boarding house porch since the church bell rang, one hand wrapped around the post, the other pressed flat against the front of her dress as if she could steady her breathing by force alone. Most folks in Dry Creek knew Abigail as the kind of woman who missed very little and repeated even less. She ran the boarding house with clean sheets, sharp eyes, and a silence that made traveling men lower their voices without knowing why. If she had gone pale at Cole Mercer's words, it meant one of two things. Either she knew something, or she feared someone. In a town like Dry Creek, those two things often sat in the same chair. Cole saw her the same moment Rose did. He did not point. He did not call her out before she was ready. That would have sent her back behind her own fear. Instead he turned toward Sheriff Voss and spoke to the square as a whole. The trouble with a lie, he said, is that it needs everybody to keep standing in the same place. The moment one person steps aside, the whole thing starts looking crooked. Sheriff Voss tried to hold his ground, but the words had already done their work. Men in the crowd no longer faced the platform as one body. They looked at Abigail. They looked at Jed Mercer. They looked at the sheriff. They looked at one another. Dry Creek had come together that evening to act certain, and now certainty was cracking right down the middle. Jed saw it too, and that was what sharpened him. This is turning into a traveling show, he said, forcing a dry laugh that landed nowhere. A tired rider, a frightened widow, and now the whole town is supposed to read guilt in a woman losing color in the heat. Abigail lowered her eyes at once, as though hoping not to be seen would make her invisible. But once a town notices a face, it does not stop noticing. Cole folded his gloves in one hand and took a few measured steps toward the boarding house, slow enough not to spook her, close enough to make his next words hers if she wanted them. No one is asking for a performance, he said. Only the truth. And if the truth scares this town, then maybe fear has been running things here longer than law. Rose felt those words settle deep inside her. Fear had been running things in Dry Creek for a long time. Fear of difference. Fear of land changing hands. Fear of names, bloodlines, old grudges, and new facts. Fear was what made decent people stand quietly beside ugly decisions and call their silence wisdom. It was what had brought her to this platform. And now it was written plain on Abigail Frost's face. Sheriff Voss stepped down from the first board of the platform and drew himself up with official stiffness, as though a straighter spine could restore command. "Miss Frost," he said, voice clipped, "if you have something relevant, speak it plain. If not, this town will not be held hostage by stares and nerves." The way he said it told Rose more than the words did. He wanted Abigail to speak, but only if she would support what had already been decided. He wanted testimony, not truth. Abigail looked from the sheriff to Cole and then, finally, to Rose. In that brief glance there was apology, and shame, and something worse than both, recognition. She knew Rose had been standing alone long before today. She knew what it cost a woman in Dry Creek to speak when the wrong men preferred quiet. "I did not see everything," Abigail said at last, her voice so soft that the first row leaned in to hear. "But I saw enough to know she was not the one Delaney met that night." The square went still so suddenly it felt as if even the dust had stopped moving. Jed Mercer opened his mouth, but Cole spoke first. "Tell them what you saw." Abigail swallowed, her fingers tightening around the porch post. "It was late. I was putting out the lamps in the front room when I noticed someone crossing from the stable lane toward the creek road. A man. He kept to the shadow of the buildings, but I knew the shape of him. Broad shoulders. Light hat. A fast walk like he did not want to be stopped." Jed's face did not change much, but Rose saw the effort it took. Cole did too. "Did you see his face?" Sheriff Voss asked quickly, almost too quickly. Abigail shook her head once. "Not clearly. But I saw where he came from. Not from Rose's place. From town." That one sentence hit Dry Creek harder than a shout could have. Because the story everyone had repeated all afternoon began with the assumption that danger had ridden in from outside, from the widow beyond the Cartonwoods, from the woman they never fully accepted. But Abigail had just shifted the shadow back where it belonged. Into town. Into familiar streets. Into the reach of familiar hands. Cole let the silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. Then he turned, slowly, toward his brother. "Funny thing," he said, his voice calm enough to chill the whole square, "for a man who claims to know so much about Rose's reasons, Jed, you have not asked a single question about the man Abigail just described. Almost like you already knew who he was." Jed Mercer let out a short breath through his nose, the kind a man gives when he knows a room is watching too closely and he has run out of easy ways to own it. For the first time since Cole had ridden into Dry Creek, Jed looked less like a man in control and more like a man calculating distance, exits, and loyalties. He glanced toward Sheriff Voss again, but the sheriff did not come to his aid. That was the first sign the ground was really shifting. Men like Voss stood tall when the story was simple. They grew careful when the story began looking back at them. "You are twisting shadows into accusations," Jed said, and though his voice was still firm, the square heard the strain in it now. "Abigail did not name me." "She did not have to," Cole answered. "You named yourself the moment you rushed to explain Delaney's business before anyone asked you to." The words dropped into the town like a stone into still water. Rose Redbird stood on the platform and watched the ripples spread across faces that had seemed so certain only minutes before. It was a strange thing to witness a crowd discover its own weakness. The same men who had crossed their arms and nodded for her punishment now shifted their weight, looked at the dirt, or studied one another as if hoping conviction might be borrowed from a neighbor. The women in the windows did not look away, but their expressions had changed too. The hard certainty had softened into something more dangerous for the lie that held this square together. Doubt. Cole stepped nearer to Jed, close enough now that the family resemblance could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The same dark hair. The same line in the jaw. The same steady eyes, though they had turned in different directions years ago. Dry Creek noticed it all at once, and when a town notices blood, it starts writing stories faster than any newspaper. Maybe we ought to hear why two Mercer brothers find themselves on opposite sides of a hanging, old Mr. Hanley muttered from the barber shop porch, not loudly, but loud enough in the silence. Jed turned toward the voice with a look sharp enough to cut the question down, but it was too late. The question was already loose. Cole did not resist it. In fact, Rose saw him accept it with the weary stillness of a man who had known this moment would come before his horse ever cleared the rise outside town. "We are brothers," Cole said plainly, and the square reacted exactly as he knew it would, with a low wave of surprise, with heads angling for a better view, with people suddenly hungry to rearrange everything they thought they understood. Same father. Same roof when we were boys. Same lessons, at least at first. Jed's face hardened. Do not drag family into this. You dragged family into it the second you thought a widow with no one standing beside her would be the easiest story to sell, Cole said. Rose felt the line strike deeper than anything yet spoken. It was not only accusation. It was history. There was old dust on those words, old anger, old choices that had split one life into two. Sheriff Voss finally found his voice again. "All right," he said sharply. "Enough grandstanding. This square is not a place for family grievances." "No," Cole said, "it is a place where this town nearly turned a grievance into a grave mistake." He shifted his attention back to the crowd before Voss could interrupt again. "You all want to know why I know Delaney had enemies, why I know he wanted Thomas Redbird's land papers, and why I know my brother is afraid of what gets said before sunset. It is because Delaney and Jed were not merely talking business. They were building something together." That landed like a dry thunderclap over the square. Jed laughed once, but now the sound broke apart before it fully formed. "Building what?" one of the ranch hands called out from the front, no longer sure which side he stood on, only sure that he wanted the truth more than the performance. Cole answered without hesitation. "A claim. Not a lawful one. A paper claim meant to redraw lines that had already been settled. To make Rose's land look uncertain and Delaney's offer look generous. They figured if paper could not move her, pressure would. And if pressure failed, scandal would." Rose closed her eyes for the briefest second because there it was at last, the shape she had sensed for months and never managed to prove. Thomas had seen it coming. That was why he had checked every receipt twice, why he had walked the fence line one extra time at dusk, why he had spoken less and listened more whenever Delaney came smiling up the road. He had known some men reached for land with pens before they reached for it with hands. Jed took a step forward then, color rising under his skin. "That is a lie." "Then tell the town where the draft papers are," Cole said. "Tell them why Delaney went to the Creek Road with the oilcloth packet he had no right to hold. Tell them why Thomas Redbird's name was written across something found in Delaney's coat." Rose's breath caught, and this time it was not fear. It was recognition. Because Thomas had once told her that if the wrong man ever got hold of those papers, the fight would not stay at the fence line. It would come straight into town, dressed up as law. And from the look on Jed Mercer's face, Rose knew Cole had just reached the part of the truth his brother would do anything to keep buried. The moment Thomas Redbird's name entered the square again, it was as if the whole town had been forced to remember a man they had found it easier to forget. Not because Thomas had ever made trouble. Quite the opposite. He had been the sort of man who made other people's dishonesty feel louder simply by living straight. He worked his own land, kept his own counsel, paid what he owed, and expected the same from others. Men like Frank Delaney smiled at men like Thomas because they could not bully them in public without revealing too much. Men like Jed Mercer smiled because they believed patience could accomplish what pressure could not. And now, with sunset stretching long bars of orange light across the square, that quiet patience had come back to haunt them both. Sheriff Elias Voss looked as though he wanted to seize the whole evening by the collar and drag it back to the simple version he had sold the town before Cole Mercer arrived. But simple stories were slipping fast. A ranch hand in the front asked what oilcloth packet Cole meant. A woman near the post office whispered to her sister that Thomas always did carry documents wrapped against rain and dust. Mr. Hanley on the porch said he had seen Delaney with papers before, though he had not known whose they were. Piece by piece, Dry Creek was doing something it should have done hours ago. It was thinking. Jed Mercer took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair, buying himself one more second. "You have no packet," he said. "You have no paper. You have nothing but trail talk and grief." Cole did not rise to the insult. That was what unsettled Rose most about him. He never seemed eager to win the moment. He seemed willing to wait for the truth to do its own work. "I have enough," he said, "because I rode through Arroyo Bend 2 days ago and found the man Delaney hired to draw the new boundary notes." A sound moved through the crowd, low and rough. Dry Creek knew Arroyo Bend. It was where men went for feed, freight, and services they preferred to keep one county over. The survey clerk remembered Delaney because Delaney paid cash and asked too many questions about how to make an old line appear unsettled on a fresh page. The clerk also remembered the second man who came with him. He said that man never gave his name. But he wore a silver watch chain with a broken clasp. Cole let his gaze settle on Jed's vest. On the silver chain fastened there. On the clasp, slightly bent and bright in the last of the daylight. Jed's hand moved toward it without thinking, and that single reflex did more damage than any accusation could have. Rose saw 3 people in the front row notice it at once. Then 5. Then more. The town did not need proof yet. It had seen recognition. It had seen fear reach for itself. That chain could belong to any man, Jed snapped, but his voice had lost the calm he had worn like a good coat all evening. "Not any man in this town," Cole said. "Only one man wears silver in the daytime and calls it modesty." A few nervous laughs escaped the edges of the square, and Jed heard the danger in them. Once people began laughing at a powerful man, even quietly, his power had already started to crack. Sheriff Voss stepped in before the mood could turn further. Even if Delaney was seeking new boundary notes, that does not prove Rose had no quarrel with him. "No," Cole said, "but it proves Delaney had designs on something he had not earned, and it proves Jed knew more about those designs than he has admitted." Rose felt the shift more strongly now. The square no longer seemed built around her shame. It was rearranging itself around another center, another question, another face. Her wrists were still bound. The platform was still under her feet. The whole ugly machinery of the evening still stood where it had before. But its certainty was gone, and certainty had been the strongest rope in town. Cole turned his head just enough to let his next words carry to everyone. Thomas Redbird knew the papers mattered. That is why he made a copy of one key page and hid it where a thief would not think to look. Rose's breath caught. She had not known that. Thomas had told her many things, warned her about many men, but there had been weeks near the end when sickness took more of his strength than either of them admitted, and some plans must have stayed behind his eyes. Jed heard it too, and for the first time that evening he looked not merely cornered but startled. Truly startled. "You are bluffing," he said. "Am I?" Cole asked. "Then why does it bother you that Rose might still have something Delaney never found?" That was the line that changed the feeling in the square entirely. Until then, Dry Creek had been listening to whether Rose was innocent. Now it began wondering whether Rose had been the target all along. Not because she had done something, but because she still possessed something. A paper. A line. A truth. A threat to men who preferred to own all 4. Rose lifted her chin, and in that instant memory flashed through her sharp as desert light, Thomas at the table one winter night, coughing into his sleeve, then looking up with tired eyes and saying, "If anything happens, do not trust the first man who offers help and do not fear the first man who demands your land." She had not understood the full weight of it then. She understood now. Across the square Abigail Frost pressed a hand to her mouth as if another truth had just found her too. And when Rose followed Abigail's gaze, she saw it settle not on Jed, not on the sheriff, but on the old livery barn at the edge of town, where something hidden had been waiting all along. Abigail Frost had not taken her eyes off the old livery barn since Cole Mercer spoke of a hidden page, and once Rose Redbird noticed it, she could not stop seeing the same thing. Not the barn itself, not the weathered boards or the half-broken sign swinging in the evening breeze, but the fact that Abigail looked at it the way people look at places tied to memory they wish would stay buried. Dry Creek felt it too. The square had gone so quiet that even small sounds stood out now, a boot shifting in dust, a wagon chain tapping against wood, the dry creak of the platform beneath Rose's feet. Every person there had come expecting an ending. Instead they were standing in the middle of a beginning they did not understand. Cole followed Abigail's gaze and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of pressure. "Miss Frost," he said at last, and his voice had changed. It was gentler now, less a challenge than a bridge. "Whatever you are afraid of has already brought this town too far. If there is something in that barn the people of Dry Creek should know about, now is the hour to say it." Abigail pressed her lips together. For one long second Rose thought she might turn away and let fear keep its seat after all. Then Abigail stepped down from the boarding house porch. The movement was so small and yet so impossible that the crowd opened for her without being told. Men who had stood stubborn all evening gave way as if some old instinct had reminded them that truth, when it finally decides to walk forward, does not ask permission. Abigail stopped near the front, close enough now for Rose to see the tremor in her hands. "The night Mr. Delaney went to the creek road," she said, "I saw more than a man crossing from town." Sheriff Voss started to speak, but no one was looking at him anymore. "I saw him stop at the livery barn first. He did not go inside through the front. He used the side door, the one with the broken latch. He came out carrying something flat under his coat." A murmur ran through the square like wind through dry grass. Cole did not interrupt. He knew the weight of a witness was not only in what she said, but in what she finally allowed herself to remember in public. "How do you know it was him?" Jed Mercer asked, and though he tried to make the question sound steady, it landed wrong. Too fast. Too eager. Too afraid. Abigail turned toward him then, and for the first time that evening there was no apology in her face. "Because the moon was bright enough, and because I have watched men lie from that porch for 10 years, she said. Frank Delaney had a narrow way of walking, like he thought the ground should move aside for him. I would know it anywhere. A few people in the crowd let out quiet breaths at that, because the description was true enough to feel like proof even before proof appeared. Rose could see the story changing shape in their minds. Delaney had gone to the barn before the creek road. He had taken something. He had gone to meet someone. And whatever he carried had mattered enough to hide. Cole nodded once. "What happened after?" Abigail swallowed. "I saw another man come later. Not long after. He came from the far side of town and used the same side door. I did not see what he took, if anything. But when he came back out, he shut the door too carefully, like a man who did not want anyone noticing it had been opened at all." "Did you see his face?" Sheriff Voss asked. Again that quickness. Again that hope that if she said no, the truth might be made smaller. Abigail looked toward the platform, toward Rose, and then beyond her into the deepening orange sky, as if drawing courage from a place larger than Dry Creek. "No," she said. "Not then. But the next morning, before the men rode out saying they had found Mr. Delaney, I saw Mr. Jed Mercer coming from the livery yard with hay dust on his cuffs and a key ring in his hand." The square broke into whispers so fast they nearly became a roar. Jed took one step forward, face flushed now, every polished inch of him suddenly looking like costume instead of character. "That proves nothing," he said. "I own stock. I have business at the yard. At dawn." Mr. Hanley called from the porch. "Before breakfast," another man said from near the hitch rail. Questions started rising from the crowd now, not from Cole, not from Rose, but from Dry Creek itself. That was when Rose knew the center had shifted for good. No one was looking at her as the answer anymore. They were looking at the Mercers, the sheriff, the barn, the road, the papers, the places where power hid when it thought no one would dare open the door. Cole let the questions build just long enough, then raised one hand. There is only one reason Delaney would hide papers in a barn before meeting someone in secret, he said. He knew what he had was worth more than cash and dangerous enough to get him watched. Rose felt a hard, bright certainty rise in her chest. Thomas had hidden a copy. Delaney had found something else. Jed had known where to look. The barn was not just part of the story. It was the hinge holding the whole thing together. Then Abigail said the one thing that made every whisper stop cold. "There is more," she said. The side door was still not latched this afternoon. Whatever Delaney hid in there might still be inside. For a moment no one in Dry Creek moved. The last of the sun hung low over the rooftops, turning the dust in the square to copper and gold, and every face seemed caught between shame and hunger, between the wish to know the truth and the fear of what truth might cost. Rose Redbird felt it in the stillness around her. All day the town had been rushing forward, eager to finish something ugly before doubt could catch up. Now doubt had arrived, and it was walking through the square like it belonged there. Sheriff Elias Voss looked toward the livery barn, then toward the platform, then back at the crowd, and Rose could see the calculation in his eyes as plainly as if he had spoken it. If he let this continue, he risked losing control. If he stopped it now, he risked showing everyone that control had been all he ever had. Jed Mercer saw the same danger, and unlike the sheriff, he did not try to hide it. "This is madness," he said, his voice rising just enough to betray him. "You are going to turn a town upside down over gossip and old paper." "No," Cole Mercer answered, steady as ever. "This town turned itself upside down the minute it chose convenience over truth." He did not look at Rose when he said it, but she felt the words like a hand cutting one more rope she had been standing under all day. The crowd shifted again, not away from the platform now, but toward the possibility waiting at the livery yard. Men who had arrived ready to witness judgment were suddenly eager to witness discovery. That was the nature of a crowd. It loved certainty until certainty broke, and then it loved revelation even more. Mr. Hanley was the first to speak up. "If there is something in that barn, then let us see it." Another voice followed from near the hitch rail. Then another. Within seconds the demand had spread across the square, not loud, not wild, but firm enough to make Sheriff Voss understand that the town would not be steered back so easily. Rose watched the sheriff straighten his coat and try to reclaim some official shape. "No one goes anywhere," he said. "Not until I say so." But even he could hear how thin it sounded now. Cole turned toward him with the calm of a man who had expected this resistance from the beginning. "You wanted order," he said. "Then do your job. Search the barn. Search it before the light goes." That cornered Voss in front of everyone. Refuse, and he would look afraid. Agree, and he might uncover the thing he had been hoping would stay hidden until dark. Rose saw the answer in his face before he gave it. Men like Voss never chose courage first. They chose the path that left them standing the longest. "Fine," he said, clipped and cold. "We search." A restless murmur broke across the square, and for the first time since they dragged her there, Rose heard something in it that had nothing to do with her. Guilt. Curiosity. Suspicion. Unease aimed somewhere else. Jed stepped forward at once. "This is a waste of time." Cole's eye settled on him. "Funny," he said, "you were in such a hurry a little while ago. Now you cannot stand one more minute." The line struck home so cleanly that several people near the front looked straight at Jed instead of away from him. The polished vest, the watch chain, the boots too clean for a man claiming ordinary business at dawn. Small things, but towns were built on small things noticed too late. Rose lifted her chin and looked past them all toward the old livery barn. She remembered passing it weeks ago on a supply run, remembered seeing Frank Delaney near the side yard, speaking low with someone she had not been able to place from a distance. At the time, she had thought little of it. Delaney spoke low only when money or mischief was involved, and Dry Creek had grown too used to both. But now the memory returned sharper than before. Thomas had warned her that some men hide theft under paperwork because it lets them pretend they are still respectable. Land taken with a forged line looked cleaner than land taken with open force. That was what this had always been about. Not anger. Not revenge. Not even Frank Delaney alone. It was about paper strong enough to steal a future, and a widow easy enough to blame before anyone looked too closely. Sheriff Voss called for 2 deputies, and they began moving toward the barn with the stiff urgency of men who knew the whole town was watching their backs. Cole stayed where he was, though Rose could see the tension in him now, not fear exactly, but the strain of a man standing 1 heartbeat away from the proof he had gambled everything on. Abigail Frost remained near the front, pale but steadier than before, as though speaking once had made the next breath possible. Jed did not move at all. That was what struck Rose most. A man with nothing to fear would have gone with the search. A man with nothing to hide would have demanded it be done faster. But Jed stood rooted to the dirt, eyes fixed on the livery yard, looking less like a citizen waiting for answers and more like a man listening for a trap. He could no longer avoid. Then one of the deputies reached the side door, pushed against the broken latch, and the barn gave way with a low wooden groan that seemed to roll clear across Dry Creek like a warning no one could take back. The barn seemed to hold its breath with the rest of Dry Creek. When the side door swung inward, the smell of old hay, leather, and sun-dried wood drifted into the square, and every person standing there leaned toward it as if truth might come walking out on its own. Sheriff Elias Voss signaled the deputies forward, but even from where Rose Redbird stood on the platform, she could see the hesitation in them now. A search ordered in confidence looked one way. A search ordered in front of a town that had nearly made a terrible mistake looked another. The first deputy stepped inside. The second followed with a lantern lifted high, though the last light of day still reached through the cracks in the walls. Outside, no one spoke above a whisper. Cole Mercer stood with his face turned toward the opening, still as fence stone, while Jed Mercer looked like a man trying not to run without letting anyone see that he wanted to. Rose had spent the whole day being watched as if her face contained the answer to everything. Now, for the first time, she was the one watching others unravel. It was a strange kind of justice, quiet and not yet complete, but real enough to feel. She looked at Jed and saw what she had not been allowed to see before. Not a strong man. Not a respected man. Just a man who had been protected by timing, by money, and by the town's willingness to believe the easiest story first. The first deputy emerged after a long half-minute that felt like 5. In his hands was an oilcloth bundle darkened by dust and age around the edges but tied recently enough that the knot had not stiffened. A sound moved through the crowd, not loud, but deep. It was the sound of a town realizing the thing it had mocked as gossip had just been lifted into plain view. Sheriff Voss took the bundle, and for a second Rose thought he might try to keep it closed, to say it would be opened later, somewhere quieter. Somewhere safer for men like him. But the crowd had passed the point of quiet obedience. "Open it," someone called. Then another voice. Then 3 more. Voss looked trapped by the demand because he was. He crouched slightly, set the bundle on the edge of the watering trough near the front of the square, and untied the cord with fingers that had lost some of their steadiness. Inside were papers, folded flat and wrapped with more care than honesty. A survey draft. Boundary markings. Payment notes. A receipt from Arroyo Bend. And on the back page, in Frank Delaney's hand, a list of names and parcels with numbers beside them, as if homes, fences, and family history could all be reduced to a bargain on a dry goods sheet. Mr. Hanley stepped down from the porch and squinted hard at the pages. Abigail Frost pressed closer, one hand at her throat. Cole did not move. He let the papers speak first. Sheriff Voss read in silence for several seconds, and each second changed his face. When he finally looked up, the certainty he had worn all evening was gone. "These are draft transfers," he said, and even his voice sounded foreign to him now. "Unsigned. Unfiled." "Read the names," Cole said. Voss hesitated. "Read them," Cole repeated. So the sheriff did. One parcel after another. One family after another. Small holdings. Edge properties. Widow land. Elder claims. Places owned by people with the least power to fight a paper war once it started. Then he stopped at the name Rose had been waiting to hear without even knowing it. Thomas Redbird. There it was. Not crossed out. Not settled. Listed as contested under revised line review. Rose felt the words strike so hard they nearly pulled the breath from her. Thomas had been right. He had seen the shape of it before illness took his strength. Delaney and Jed had not only wanted her land after Thomas died. They had been preparing to take it while he was still alive, using ink, surveys, and silence to do what open theft could not. Jed stepped forward at last, and now there was no Polish left in him, only heat and desperation. Draft papers are not proof of anything, he said. Men talk. Men plan. It does not mean a thing was done. No, Cole said, and turned to face him fully. But it proves Rose was never the reason. She was the obstacle. The crowd understood that at once. Rose saw it happen face by face. The widow they had been ready to condemn was not the danger in the story. She was the person standing between greedy men and a clean theft. Delaney had gone to the creek road because of these papers. Jed had gone to the barn because of these papers. And the town had almost helped bury the one person most likely to force the truth into daylight. Sheriff Voss looked down again, then frowned at one final page tucked into the back. It was smaller than the others and folded twice. He opened it slowly. His eye scanned the lines, then rose toward Jed with something close to alarm. "This one is signed," he said. The square went still again. "Signed by whom?" Mr. Hanley asked. Voss swallowed once, and in the orange light of evening his badge looked suddenly very small. "By Frank Delaney," he said, "and witnessed by Jed Mercer." The word seemed to drain the last warmth out of the square. Witnessed by Jed Mercer. Dry Creek did not react all at once. First there was only silence, the kind that settles after people hear something they cannot fit back into the version of the world they were using a moment before. Then came the small sounds. A woman near the bakery whispered, "Lord help us." Mr. Hanley let out a breath like a man who had been holding it since sundown. Someone in the back muttered that the whole thing had been planned. And once that thought entered the town, it spread faster than rumor ever had. Rose Redbird stood on the platform and felt the evening tilt for the second time that day. The first tilt had come when Cole Mercer rode in and broke the town's certainty. This one came deeper. This one reached bone. Because now the lie was no longer only about Frank Delaney's death. It was about all the weeks before it, all the careful steps that had led to this square, this crowd, this platform, and the easy choice of a widow as the one person least likely to be defended before sunset. Sheriff Elias Voss still held the signed page in his hands, but he no longer looked like a man holding authority. He looked like a man holding evidence that had just turned against him too. He read the bottom line again as if the ink might change under pressure. It did not. Jed Mercer's name stayed where it was, clear and deliberate. Witness to the transfer draft. Witness to the false line. Witness to the scheme that would have stripped Rose's land down to a contested mark on a county sheet. Jed took one sharp step forward. "That does not prove what you think it proves." The words were quick, but not strong. They came from the same place all his other words had come from that evening, the place where panic puts on a clean collar and pretends to be reason. Cole Mercer turned to face him fully, and in the fading light the two brothers looked less alike than ever. "Then tell them what it proves," Cole said. "Tell them why your name is on Delaney's paper. Tell them why Rose had to be guilty before anyone looked in that barn. Tell them why a dead man's plan mattered more to you than a living woman's name." That broke something in the square. Not with shouting. Not with chaos. With recognition. The men who had stood with folded arms now let them fall. The women at the windows no longer watched like spectators but like witnesses. Even the boys near the water trough had gone still, as if they sensed that whatever happened next would become one of those stories adults lower their voices for years later. Jed looked from Cole to the sheriff to the crowd, searching for an ally and finding only faces that had begun the slow, painful work of seeing him clearly. Frank Delaney made his own decisions, he said. I only saw the papers. And said nothing, Abigail Frost replied from near the front, her voice steadier now than it had been all evening. You said nothing while they pointed at her. You said nothing while this town gathered here. You said nothing because silence served you. Jed turned toward her with a look that would have frightened her an hour ago. It did not frighten her now. That was another shift Rose felt in the air. Fear was changing houses. Sheriff Voss lowered the page at last. Jed, he said, and for the first time there was no command left in his tone, only caution. You had best explain yourself. But explanation was already too late. Dry Creek had crossed into that dangerous place where people begin adding together every small thing they once ignored. Jed's urgency. Delaney's visits. The boundary talk. The dawn at the livery yard. The hidden all-cloth packet. The witness signature. Each detail alone might have been shrugged away. Together they formed a road straight through the middle of the lie. Rose looked out at the faces before her and saw shame there now, raw and plain. Some could not meet her eyes. Some tried and failed. A few did look at her, and what she saw in them was worse than hatred had been. It was understanding. Understanding meant they knew what they had almost done. Cole took one step toward the platform and lifted his chin toward Sheriff Voss. Cut her loose, he said. No one objected. That was how complete the turn had become. Hours ago they would have shouted him down. Now the only question left was how long the town would force itself to stand in disgrace before doing the one decent thing still available. Voss hesitated, but only a moment. Then he nodded to a deputy. The man climbed the platform with eyes lowered and hands careful, as if gentleness now might repay what cruelty had nearly cost. As the binding around Rose's wrists came away, the square watched in total silence. She rubbed nothing, said nothing, thanked no one. She only stepped down from the boards under her own strength and turned to face the crowd that had expected never to answer to her again. The evening wind moved through the street, cooler now, carrying dust and the faint smell of sage from beyond town. Jed Mercer backed away once, then stopped himself, realizing too late that retreat looked too much like guilt when everyone was already counting the reasons. Sheriff Voss looked from Rose to the papers to Jed, and whatever bargain he had once made with convenience was crumbling in front of him. You will stay where you are, he said to Jed, trying to recover some fragment of the law. But before Jed could answer, before Cole could speak again, Rose lifted her voice for the first time since the square filled. It was not loud, but it carried farther than any shouting could have. My husband knew this was coming, she said. Every face turned to her. Thomas Redbird told me there was one more page no thief would ever find in a barn, because he did not hide it in a place men searched with keys. He hid it in a place only a faithful man would think to check. Even Cole looked at her then with surprise. Rose let the word settle. She had kept silent not because she had nothing to say, but because Thomas had taught her that truth means more when spoken at the exact moment a lie has nowhere left to stand. She looked toward the church at the far end of Dry Creek, its white boards dim in the last light, and then back at the town. And if I am right, she said, the page that ends all of this is not in the barn at all. The square did not move at first. Dry Creek had already been forced to reconsider one lie, and now Rose Redbird was offering them a truth even larger, one that did not begin in the barn or end with Frank Delaney's hidden papers. It began with Thomas, with the kind of careful foresight that honest men learn when they live too long among those who mistake patience for weakness. Rose stood with her freed hands at her sides, the marks of the bindings still fresh on her wrists, and looked not at Jed Mercer, not at Sheriff Elias Voss, but at the church at the far end of town where the last light of day rested pale against the white boards. Thomas trusted two things, she said, and the silence in Dry Creek bent around every word. The truth, and the place men only remember when they want to be seen as decent. Mr. Hanley's head lifted first. Abigail Frost followed his gaze. Then Cole Mercer turned toward the church, and Rose saw understanding reach him before anyone else. Thomas had known men like Delaney would search cabins, fence lines, sheds, and barns. He had known they would search the places where property lived, because that was all such men believed mattered. But Thomas had also known they would overlook the one place built for conscience, because men who scheme in daylight always assume no one is brave enough to hide evidence in plain sight beneath a bell tower. Sheriff Voss swallowed once and motioned toward the church without speaking. No one questioned it now. The whole town moved as one body, slower than before, chastened by what it had nearly done and by the woman they were now following instead of condemning. Rose walked at the front beside Cole, not behind him, not shielded by him, but beside him, and that alone told Dry Creek more than any speech could have. By the time they reached the church steps, the evening had cooled. The heat had broken. The first hint of night was stretching over the roofs, and with it came that strange frontier hush when the day's noise falls away and people can hear their own thoughts whether they want to or not. Pastor Wilkes met them at the door, startled by the sight of the whole town arriving at once, then more startled still by Rose walking free among them. He looked from the sheriff to the papers in Voss's hand to the faces gathered on the steps, and whatever question he meant to ask died before it reached his mouth. Rose stepped past him into the small white church, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her boots. She did not hesitate. She went straight to the back pew on the left, knelt, reached beneath the seat, and drew out a narrow tin box wrapped in cloth. The gasp that rose behind her was not loud, but it traveled through every person there. Rose stood and placed the box in Sheriff Voss's hands. Thomas said if men ever came for our land with smiles on their faces and paper in their pockets, this would be what they feared more than any gun or rumor, she said. Voss opened it carefully. Inside was a folded deed copy, older survey notes, water right confirmations, and one signed statement in Thomas Redbird's own hand explaining, in clear and steady detail, that Frank Delaney had approached him twice with an offer tied to altered boundary lines, and that Jed Mercer had been present the second time. There was more. A notation from the county clerk dated months earlier confirming the original line as lawful and final. No contest. No ambiguity. No confusion. Thomas had done what the town had failed to do. He had prepared for dishonesty before it could dress itself as law. Sheriff Voss read the pages in silence, then handed them to Mr. Hanley, who read them too, and then to Pastor Wilkes, whose face tightened with quiet sorrow. By the time the documents returned to Voss's hands, there was no room left in Dry Creek for denial. Jed Mercer did not argue. That was how everyone knew it was finished. A man with a story still left will reach for it. Jed only stood on the church steps with his jaw set and his eyes hollow, like a man who had finally discovered that polished boots and a strong name could carry him only as far as the next honest page. Cole said nothing to him. The silence between the brothers held more history than the town could ever fully know. Sheriff Voss straightened, and for the first time that evening his voice sounded like law instead of convenience. He said Jed would answer for his part in the scheme and that Frank Delaney's papers would be sent to the county seat by morning. No one cheered. A town that has nearly committed a wrong does not earn the right to cheer when it finally stops itself. Outside, the last sunlight faded entirely, and lanterns began to glow in windows up and down the street. One by one, people turned toward Rose, not with the easy confidence they had carried into the square, but with the uncertain weight of guilt. Some looked ready to apologize. Some looked as though apology would never be enough. Rose did not ask for either. She took the tin box from the sheriff, held it close for one quiet moment, and then faced the people of Dry Creek with a calm no crowd had managed to break. My husband's name stays with this land, she said. So does mine. That was all. No pleading. No triumph. No speech meant to comfort the people who had failed her. Just truth, given plain and final. It settled over Dry Creek harder than judgment ever had. Cole Mercer stepped down off the church porch and toward his horse, and Rose watched him for a second before following with her eyes rather than her feet. He had come when no one else would. He had spoken when the town had chosen silence. Yet even now he did not stay to collect gratitude like a prize. That, more than anything, made Rose trust him. At the hitch rail he paused, turned once, and met her gaze across the dim street. In that look there was respect, and an old sorrow, and the quiet understanding of two people who knew that surviving injustice was not the same as forgetting it. Then he nodded, mounted, and rode out of Dry Creek under the first stars of evening. The town remained where it was, smaller than before, humbled by the proof in Thomas Redbird's careful hand and by the woman they had thought stood alone. Rose stayed on the church steps until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the open dark. Then she turned back toward the road leading to the Cartonwoods and the cabin that was still hers, and she walked toward it with her head high, while behind her an entire town stood in the wreckage of its own certainty, knowing it would never again be able to pretend it had not seen exactly who she was.